I was doing a bit of research yesterday, and I discovered that you left office 2 days before the release of the first iPhone. So lots of kind of ground to cover.
Right.
Clearly that
I didn't have an insightful moment.
You're not going to start an app business or anything. That was obviously followed by a great period of optimism about technology, about the positive change. Particularly, I remember during the coalition era that many of these people in this room will kind of remember. Today, the mood's changed a little bit. There are significant issues around technology, some of which Francesca was discussing: the gig economy, loss of jobs through automation, privacy, the establishment of very powerful monopolies. Do you think the challenge for government today is that essentially we have a policy framework that's designed effectively for the offline world?
Yes, I do. But first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be at the WIRE conference. Thank you for inviting me. And you know, before I start, my children always tell me that I shouldn't really talk about technology in public because they have a vast amount of accumulated evidence that I don't understand it. But so with that qualification, yeah, no, I think we've got a regulatory system that's designed for one age, and we're living in a different age altogether. And what we suggested this morning in the paper that's been put together by Chris Yu, who is our technology expert who works for the Institute, is essentially to say you've got to change the regulatory system. You've got to have one regulator for big tech particularly, that we need to pull into one system of regulation all the different parts of what's happening with not just large tech, but the implications it has for society, for consumers, for business. And I only just caught part of the presentation from Professor Matsukato, but I think all of those questions that she's raising about how you go between, if you like, the Silicon Valley model and what's going to be happening in China. I think this is the central challenge for policymakers in the UK and obviously in Europe.
So Uber's in the Court of Appeal this week to determine whether its drivers should be classified as workers or self-employed. Chancellor on Monday talked about a digital services tax so that large tech companies should pay a fairer share. I think maybe one of the challenges we face at the moment is that Silicon Valley talks about, Mark Zuckerberg talks about the fact that he's going to fix Facebook. Is it just the case that we're kind of beyond that now, and government has got to find a way of aligning the incentives of private organizations, private companies, with the broader public interest?
Yeah, for sure. And you see, look, the problem is that, for example, if you take what the government's doing with this, the digital tax, okay, you can argue about it whether it's a good idea or it's a bad idea, but the important thing is it doesn't really meet the scale of the problem. I mean, the reason why retail is under pressure is because it's being completely disrupted, and it's being disrupted by technology that is being used by consumers as a matter of choice. So the problem for the retail sector is not whether their business rates are reduced a little bit or not. The problem is it's subject to a complete disruption from technology, and it's going to have to rethink its model. And that's why government's got to be engaged with this in a completely different way, and government doesn't properly understand the technological revolution. It doesn't understand its implications. And look, I mean, to be absolutely honest, with our government at the moment, it's not got the bandwidth to consider it. So the central question of our time, which is how do you prepare for this digital transformation and get government geared to help people through it and business through it, that is almost absent from the political debate. The extraordinary thing about the political debate at the moment is, well, here, I mean, it's obviously focused on the issue that it's a pleasure, frankly, not to talk about, but you can't not talk about it because it's so pervasive. But that's what we're focused on, whereas the actual conversation we should be having is precisely the types of things you're discussing today.
Sure. I mean, I read the report last night, and it was very kind of articulate in the way that it talked about the way that software-based businesses are rewarded by economies of scale and that Silicon Valley term network effects. Isn't that just another way of saying, though, that large technology companies are effectively monopolies today, and their size and power effectively, the crucial thing is it's stifling innovation, right? They acquire smaller companies or they crush them. And that we need to think about how we bring through that kind of next level of innovation that maybe is getting capped because of large tech.
Yeah, so I think there are two different questions. There's the question of how you make sure that the the big companies don't squash innovation and competition.
Yeah.
And this is where, by the way, I think GDPR has certain issues around it, as to what its impact's really going to be on the competitive space. But then there's a second question, which is that these technologies create platforms, essentially. And what happens is that every walk of life and every activity is going to have its digital twin, or potentially could. In theory it could, and in practice it often will. And as a result of that, what's going to happen is that you're going to get this massive disruption, and it's going to cause us to have to rethink the way that companies operate. So you've got the issue of regulation, but then you've got the actual disruption of the technology itself. It's going to cause changes in the way the business operates. It's going to cause changes in the way consumers consume. It's going to cause massive changes in the workplace. And when we talk about the gig economy, we talk about it usually in terms of sort of Uber and so on. But I can see this also happening in different spheres of professional life, where people are going to work differently and want to work differently. So you're going to have a system of regulation that takes account of the fact that some people will desire to work in this new way. So you're going to have to engage in a whole new debate about workplace rights and protection for people, at the same time as not stifling the ability of people to work in a flexible way they actually like. Which is why whenever you do the analysis of what Uber drivers think, or people who work for Deliveroo or other such services, when you do the analysis of what they actually think, yes, there are real anxieties about exploitation, but no, people don't want to give up the flexibility they think that work offers them.
You talk about workers' rights. What Silicon Valley always tell us is that what we need to do is introduce universal basic income. Where are you on that? Do you think that's an idea we should be entertaining, or do you think that's basically just a fig leaf?
So one of the things that I learned about government is that it's really bad at experimenting.
Okay.
And this is something, I don't know what I think about it.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's worth exploring. But whether it really works or not, I don't know. But why not experiment with it? And that's one of the advantages, actually, of using the city structure. One of the things that's really interesting to me is if you look at the US today, all the politics focuses on, pretty naturally, on the president and the administration. But actually, if you look at what's happening at a city level or at a state level in the US, it's often more interesting than what's happening at the federal level. And so I think, with universal basic income, I'm a skeptic, but I'm a skeptic who's prepared to be convinced if someone shows me there's a way it can work.
The report calls for a new transatlantic alliance for technology between the US and EU, leaving aside the thing that we shall not mention. Isn't this kind of a big ask, though, at a time when policy is often kind of inward-looking, and there's this escalating nationalism that...
Yeah, so, many of the people here are much more qualified to talk about this than me, but I'm just looking at this in a very simple political way. Is what is happening with technology revolutionary? That's the first question. I think it is.
Yeah.
Right. So if it is, does the scale of the public policy response match the scale of the revolution? No. Okay. So when people say, well, it's incredibly ambitious, I would say, well, it was incredibly ambitious to imagine after the Second World War that you would put in place a whole set of institutions like NATO and so on, but they did it because it mattered. And I think when you look at it, what is the single biggest challenge that we're going to face when my sort of grandchildren are the age of my children? It's going to be the rise of China geopolitically.
Sure.
The thing that people don't, we're really, I think, not understanding in the West just how big this challenge geopolitically is going to be. China is going to have a power that no non-Western country has ever had in modern history. So it is going to challenge for the 21st century leadership. And it's going to challenge it, not just economically, but politically, militarily, and it's going to offer, by the way, a different way of working altogether. If you look at that social credit system, I'm reading about it now. Okay. Is it possible to look at that and not feel at least some pang of anxiety? Okay. You're literally not a rational person if you don't think, well, hang on, What does that mean? So, okay, fast forward to the middle of this century. If China achieves what it wants to achieve, and which is set out in it, by the way, its 2025 plan, never mind the middle of the century, its power is going to be enormous in the technology sphere. Now, again, I'm not an expert in this, but what I read teaches me that in AI particularly, it could well challenge America, if not beat America. Okay. So in those circumstances, what is the West going to do? If it's going to have to ensure, almost like it used to ensure in military terms, that it's got superiority, it's going to have to prepare itself for this forthcoming change in the whole geopolitics, which has got its resonance in technology. So when I say I think the Europeans and the Americans got to work together so that their regulatory systems align, this is, to me, common sense in the face of that threat. Okay. So, and I, by the way, hope that China evolves in a benign way. Don't misunderstand me. I'm in favor of engaging with China. I hope it evolves in a benign way, economically and politically. But its power is going to be such that you've got to prepare for every eventuality. And that's why we suggest that Europe and America put their heads together on this. And it is, you know, I'm afraid, sorry to have to mention the dreaded word Brexit, but I mean, it is why, along with all the multiplicity of other reasons, Brexit is such an unmitigated disaster, because it takes us out of having the debate we should have and puts us into a debate that is frankly completely irrelevant to how the 21st century is going to develop.
We had to go there. With China in mind, I was going to touch on the international sphere maybe later on, but let's go there now. With that in mind, given that China has said, look, we want to develop our capabilities in AI, do you think that we're going to have to start thinking about some kind of international AI treaty that's very kind of similar to like the non-proliferation of nuclear arms, something that really is operating at that kind of global level?
Yeah, we're going to have to get into all of that. And by the way, for cyber security reasons, we're going to be in that in any event.
Sure. Because
that's the other thing that's happening. And I'm noticing this right around the world at the minute. There are countries and governments prepared to use the new technology capabilities of cyber in order to, not just interfere with elections and so on, but disrupt companies, and the potential dangers of this are enormous. So we're in that anyway, and we should definitely try and secure such an arrangement. But we're going to find it tough, because China's got a different attitude, and they're not going to be constrained in the same way that our government or policymakers would be constrained. But it's another reason why the Europeans and the Americans have got to stop seeing themselves as in competition with each other and actually seek to align their regulatory environments.
So let's follow that thought through a little bit. Say you were coming into power today. Let's talk about maybe governance. How would you think about redesigning government so that consumer services now are all digital by default? How would you kind of rethink government on the lines you're describing?
So the biggest problem that I learned about government is that government bureaucracies have almost a genius for self-preservation, but are bad change makers.
Right.
So, Clement Attlee was the Labour Prime Minister after the Second World War. And if Clement Attlee came back to Britain today, he would walk the streets of London and think everything had changed. The composition of the population, the way people live, the way they work, the way they think. And then he'd go back into the seat of government, Whitehall, and he'd feel completely at home. Right? There would be literally, he would say, yeah, no, I get this. Okay, we can. So government, so when I was in office, okay, you had your health department, your education department, your transport department, law and order, defense, whatever, okay. And then you might have a bit of the business department that was technology. Today, technology suffuses everything because of its, as we said, its transformative power. So I would reorganize government pretty radically. We've actually already suggested from the Institute you actually have an Office of Digital Technology, which is staffed differently, run differently, and has a remit right across government. But this is, the thing about technology is we're in danger of a backlash against technology. unless we actually show people that, yes, there are all these privacy questions and displacement questions. There are massive challenges with technology, but let's not lose sight of the opportunities. When you think of the opportunities that AI gives you in healthcare,
Yeah.
or the opportunities to educate young people completely differently. You know, what is education about today? It's about educating people to be creative thinkers, educating them for the open mind, and also educating them in different subjects at the pace at which they're capable of learning. You've got that ability today with technology, so we should use it. Technology could transform your infrastructure and transport system. Actually, technology can even change the way that law and order works to make it far more effective. So, you know, if I was back in government today, it would literally be the single most important focus of the government. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think politically, because at the moment politics is polarizing between a right-wing nationalism and left-wing statism, I think technology also it's the opportunity, the first group of political leaders that understand it and can make sense of it and weave it into a narrative of optimism about the future, because I'm basically optimistic about what technology can do. Those are the people that will own the politics of the next couple of decades.
You mentioned some of the challenges, nationalism, populism, the rise of demagogues. Mostly people are very skilled at using social platforms, social networks. We know that social networks are designed, they have neuroscience, PhDs with neuroscience qualifications to keep users on the platform. It's an attention economy that we have now. Do you think that at the moment, the way that sort of some social networks run themselves, it's almost kind of, not only are they not necessarily good necessarily for people's mental health, but they're in some way kind of antithetical to healthy society, healthy debate?
Yeah, you know, it's a revolutionary phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's revolutionized politics.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing with politics. One of the first lessons you learn in politics is that the people that shout loudest don't necessarily deserve to be heard most. Mm-hmm. It's about the first lesson you ever learn in politics. Because I will say the test of the politician is that they're prepared to stand up and say no, because anyone can say yes.
Yeah.
Social media, I mean, look, I don't mean to be offensive, but it is the platform for the loudmouth. I mean, it is. It's clear. People, you know, so political...
Alistair Campbell's pretty successful at it.
You know, and Alistair is, you know, a classic example of that. But no, of course, what it does is, if you're not careful, it becomes an exchange of abuse and headlines. Yeah. It doesn't become a reasoned debate. Okay, so this is, and I think we've got to be honest about this, because you can't put it back in its box.
Yeah.
And then you've got the whole kind of fake news, distorted news. But the other thing that happens is that the conventional media is also disrupted, because again, technology disrupts it. So what's happening in Western politics today is that the conventional media is splitting it also into two polarized camps. So you've got a left media,
yeah,
and you've got a right media, and the media basically thinks the only way in this world of disruption they can keep their economic model, their commercial model, is to take a group of people and keep them permanently angry. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one of the things I sometimes say to people when you look at the American situation is, you know, if you read a particular sort of media, I mean, it's literally Trump from early in the morning till late at night, and what is the latest outrage?
Yeah.
And if you look at another part of the American media, it's, you know, takes a whole set of left positions and tries to rubbish them and tear them apart and so on. Mm-hmm. So you end up with a politics that's profoundly polarized. Now this is, I think, this is then social media comes along and amplifies all of that and accelerates its impact. So yeah, a huge problem today that we're going to have to work out as citizens is how you get a civilized, evidence-based policy debate back into politics in circumstances where actually people are dividing into tribes that basically don't talk to each other, listen to each other, or like each other. Yeah. And this is dangerous. You know, when people say to me, could democracy ever be at threat? And, you know, some mornings I kind of wake up and think, nah, our systems are too robust, there's too much resilience in them, ultimately it won't happen. And then other times I wake up and think, you know, if you actually study the history post First World War, it's very interesting what happened. Because of course there was the whole economic backdrop. And even though we've got many economic challenges today, they're obviously not nearly as serious as they were back in the 20s and 30s. But the one thing that is the same is that what happened to politics in the West is that it became intensely polarized. And if you end up thinking that the person that you're opposing is not someone you disagree with, but someone who is not legitimate in their point of view. In other words, if you delegitimize your opponent, at what point do you then say, you know what, we can't afford to have these people in power? Because if they come into power, they're going to delegitimize us. That's when democracy, and that's where you need your institutions to be robust, right? Your legal institutions, your media. But the media itself, the media's got to be honest with itself today. It's completely polarized. And it's controlled to a degree, by the way, by private interests that also have their own strong views.
Sure, but you need a strong media in order to have a robust
democracy. So you need a strong media, but the media's got to be genuinely independent, which means not just independent of the state.
Sure.
So I think there's a whole, again, set of questions that are going to be looked at there with a lot more depth and consideration than so far.
If you'd had social media when you were in government, do you think it would have changed the way that you communicated? Do you think that there would have been, presumably there would be huge advantages to it as well, because you can connect with people on an entirely different way and in a very immediate way?
Yeah, no, of course, you would have, I don't know whether I would have been, I probably would have been out on Twitter, I guess. But,
big on Snapchat, maybe.
Yeah, it's of course, if you were back in government today, your social media function would be your principal media function. But but I would also be looking at the policy implications of it, because I think they are, again, very, very profound.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy as people think to deal with. Because, for example, you can say, well, that Facebook or other companies should be, vigilant as to what's coming on their platforms.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely true. But I think the problems aren't just about preventing, for example, sort of hate-filled rhetoric. It's also the more insidious fact of just self-reinforcing views, the sort of echo chamber thing where no one really ever listens to the other point of view.
Yeah.
And so, this is what I was in the US a short time ago, and someone was telling me, well, we've got our Thanksgiving dinner coming up, and they said to me, well, I hope the Thanksgiving dinner's better than last year's. I said, well, what went wrong? And they said, oh, we had a terrible argument about Trump around the dinner table. So I said, because I knew the guy was a Democrat, so I said, why were the Trump supporters there? He said, no, everyone was against Trump. And I said, well, what was the argument about? Well, some people thought we weren't sufficiently anti-Trump. And that's...
it's the People's Front of Judea kind of argument.
But it also just shows you, some people, if you say, well, he made a point there, people go, what?
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier this polarization. We're seeing the kind of the politics of your government and others like Barack Obama, social liberal, progressive, business friendly though, kind of sidelined. We've seen what's happening with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Salvini in Italy, Orbán in Hungary. Angela Merkel is not going to be seeking re-election to the leadership of the CDU, the NEC of your own party. It's dominated by those with a very different view of what the Labour Party should be than yours. Do you see a way back for your kind of politics? Are progressive values under threat? You touched on this briefly, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, there is a way back, but we've got to be the change makers, not the guardians of the status quo.
Yeah.
So there is a way back, but we've got to rethink a whole set of questions. And I think there are some of those things that I understand and see the way forward on quite easily. For example, actually, I think you can at least fashion the agenda around technology and the changes. But I think there's a more difficult question, which is the nature of business today, the nature of capitalism today, how you rethink that, where I think there are big underlying questions that I'm not sure we have the right answer to, but I think you can at least identify what you should be looking at. And some of the things that Professor Metzacard was talking about earlier are some of the things that need to go into examining that agenda. But I guess what I would say is you come to it, though, without either a laissez-faire attitude from the right or an old-fashioned statist attitude from the left. Yeah. So I can see what the sort of philosophy is, but I still think there are issues around policy that are really difficult. And I think one of the things that, I always say this to people about politics, that at a certain level, politics is a very, very intellectual business. Mm-hmm. And people always say, well, no, it's not. It's just, politicians shouting at each other and so on. And I say, no, at a certain level, it's about detailed policy. Mm-hmm. And your policy only comes about because you have certain values and philosophy that give rise to and that gives rise to an agenda. Okay. So your political philosophy tells you, right, here are the issues you need to solve. So, okay, if your political philosophy is around helping people who don't have opportunity to get opportunity, you can say, here's what goes on the agenda. Yeah. Right. What does a modern welfare state look like? How do you improve educational attainment for the poorest sections of society? You can put those things on the agenda through values and philosophy. But when it comes to the practical answer, that's when the policy debate gets difficult. That's when it's a much more intellectual business. And that's where government, again, is not properly geared. Mm-hmm. Because civil servants are not the best people to decide these things. Mm-hmm. One of the things I would do if I was back in government today, I think, is alter really quite radically how you bring people into the public service space. Because, again, what's happening in society is there are specialized areas of knowledge that, if you're just sitting there as a civil servant, you're not aware of, and you're not, sure. Therefore, at that intellectual level, you're not likely to get the right answer. I mean, I find, for example, when you go out and you talk to people at the front line in a hospital or in a police station or in a school, you're more likely to get a sense of what you need to do than you are reading a policy paper that some guy writes you from the civil service. So I think you also need to shift the way that government looks at these questions. But it's all about, in an era of change, making change. But the change, if we're not careful, what we're going to do is we're going to polarize politics, so you've actually got two versions of the past competing for the future. And they're both actually conservative with a small c. One is, get the state out of everything because it's wrong. The other is put the state into everything because it's the only guardian of the public interest. Yeah. Now, I think you've got to refashion that completely.
There needs to be a new level of engagement. We're out of time. One final question. Nick Clegg's off to Facebook. Any thoughts on maybe going to Silicon Valley? Google, maybe? I don't know. Snapchat?
No, I think the inhibition that my children mentioned earlier would probably disqualify me. But anyway, good luck to Nick. I hope he does well there. And I think it's understanding this world is really important for politicians. So let me end on this, just saying one of the things I'm trying to create in the Institute at the moment is a center where you get change makers and policy makers sitting together. Because the single biggest risk, and I know everyone here is from the technology sector, the single biggest risk is that the ignorance of the politicians, not their ill will, but their ignorance about technology and the changes that it's making, lead to bad public policy, which in the world that I've described is a very dangerous thing. So that's why, at the very least, we need to have a proper dialogue, which is why I'm delighted to come here today.
Well, Tony Blair, thank you so much for your time. It's delightful hearing your views.
Thank you. Thank you.